Hello, I'm Kads and welcome to today's video. So today we're going to be talking about fusions and more specifically answering the question, which type of fusion between traditional, fragment, and hybrid styles yields the best return in terms of champion quality. This video is going to be broken up into two main parts because of course champion quality is a subjective metric. So I intend to discuss what my rating system is as well as go through how I rated all of the fusions that we're going to talk about today. And then of course for the second part we're going to be diving into the nerd stuff to see what the math says is the best style of fusion to partake in. So for starters, let's talk about the system that I use to rate the fusions. I know the traditional format is like a tier list ranking champions from like S to D or S to F, but I feel like that form doesn't really do champions enough justice in terms of just calling them good or bad. So instead, we're going to be rating each champion from 1 through 5, and each of those numbers has a distinct definition behind it. 1, I'm defining as practically useless, which is kind of what it says on the tin, but they have no practical purpose in the game. That doesn't mean that they don't have some form of utility. It just means that their utility happens to not fit into the game in any way, shape, or form. 2, I'm defining as unhelpful niche, which means they have some place in the game, maybe one particular area, but it's not an area that you typically need help in, or there are plenty of champions who could do the job better while also bringing some other forms of utility and or requiring less resources to do said job. 3, I'm defining as useful but niche, which is a step above, meaning that there is a couple of places in the game where they are useful, but only in those situations. And there's a lot of room for nuance in this category, but this is where you'd expect majority of champions to be. Every champion cannot be useful everywhere. 4, I'm defining as very impactful, which means they're useful in multiple areas of the game, but they are still not as good as 5, which I'm defining as game changers, meaning they have changed the game in some way for the better, either defining a new meta, championing a new approach to old content, or being extremely useful for some new content. So with our metrics defined, let's dive into how I rated each of these champions. If you don't care about my subjective opinion on all these fusions, then you can skip ahead to the results close to the end of the video. And this spreadsheet will be linked in the description box down below if you'd like to check it out for yourself and see these results in more detail. So we have a list of fusions. We have each of their different styles, traditional, fragment, and or hybrid. And then you'll note that we have two different columns here for the ratings. The first column is the champion's rating relative to when they were released, because that is what most people are going to go off of when they're deciding whether or not to participate in any given fusion. You won't have the benefit of hindsight necessarily to help you decide if the champion has aged well, but that is nonetheless represented in the second column, which is their rating as I interpret it today. And this is a good measure of seeing how fusions age over time, because they might be a game changer when they come out and decay into something worse later down the line, or they might be completely irrelevant when they first came out, but a buff or a new piece of content came out that brought them into the spotlight. Admittedly, you will never know that ahead of time, so that's impossible to gauge or guess because you never know which champions are going to get buffed or when they might become relevant in some new content. But nonetheless, the historical perspective might help draw some conclusions that you might want to use going forward. Another thing to point out is that I am starting this list from the fusions that began when I started to play near the end of 2020, just because I have an accurate representation of the community sentiment at that time. There were plenty of fusions before that, but I can't necessarily speak to how people felt about them at that time. Plus, a lot of fusions back before then were a lot less formal than we have them now. We have a fairly consistent formula when it comes to fusions nowadays, and so it's better to kind of represent the modern era of fusions because of course we're deciding to do fusions in the current present modern era. I will try my best not to go through every single ability on every single one of these champions and just talk about the high and low lights that equated to them getting the score that they received. So we're starting things off with arguably one of the most controversial fusions of all time, at least again in the modern era, that being Pixneal. So Pixneal was infamous for her 18 legendary tome requirement across all of her abilities and her passive, and she used to have a pretty garbage A3, used to be a 5-time hitter at random, and you can only freeze if you hit 2 of the same target. Over the years, she's gotten a handful of buffs that have made her a little bit better. She's a lot better at freezing, she's a lot better at countering Torment with the passive, but nothing can really combat the fact that she still needs 18 legendary tomes. So Pixneal, of course, was a traditional fusion, and when she came out, she was dragged through the mud as probably the worst fusion in the game, so definitely earned the 1 ranking, practically useless. And nowadays, after like 2 or 3 iterations of buffs, I give her like a 2. She's a little bit better. She's decent at countering Torments. She's decent for a little bit of CC, but again, the books just don't make it really worth it, so she hasn't got past a 2 in my opinion. Iron Brago is next, and he was a fragment summon champion most famous for his increased defense on a 3-turn cooldown for a 3-turn duration across your entire team, so full uptime on increased defense, as well as having AoE decrease attack, and then the passive where you can just boost your team's defense by some fraction of his defense. When he came out, he was very impactful because back then a lot more people had traditional clan boss teams because Unkillable was popular but not as pervasive as it is today, and so he was a solid option for keeping your team alive. But nowadays, because we have more Unkillable options available with Demitha in the mix, Helikath, as well as Wixwell, he's just kind of fallen off and traditional teams are a lot less used. And so in my opinion, he has decayed down to a 3. He's still useful for Demon Lord clan boss traditional teams, but that is more of a niche use case in today's meta. Astralon is a perfect example of a middling champion who has decent multipliers and a little bit of control with the AoE stun on a 4-turn cooldown, but he never really saw much play outside of that in super niche arena situations or just kind of control against enemy waves or PvE content. He was a traditional fusion and his utility has kind of waxed and waned over the years, but he hasn't really moved from his status as a 3, useful but niche. Jiroshi the Drunkard was a fragment summon champion, the first Shadowkin champion added to the game, and he kind of like Astralon has been middle of the road his entire existence. He has some utility setting up bomb champions with the increased attack and increased accuracy, and a little bit of CC with the AoE True Fear, but there have been a lot of champions that have come out now that have increased attack and increased accuracy, so he's not as useful as them, or you could simply have a combination of like Arbiter and Lady Mikage if you want to run increased attack and increased accuracy with a little bit more utility. Underpriest Brogni was the first Hybrid fusion ever added to the game, and he's also the first game changer on our list, at least at the time of his release. Most infamous, of course, for the A3 increased attack, block debuffs, as well as the shield, which cannot be removed, but of course it synergizes with this passive to reflect damage back to the attacker, which can work with Giant Slayer, and also heals allies by some of the damage sent into the shield. He was a mainstay for traditional clan boss teams alongside Iron Brago. He made a lot of teams affinity friendly with the A3, and of course he was a pioneer as the first champion who could increase the value of shields and introduced a whole new meta, that being infinity composition teams in Demon Lord clan boss and other areas of the game. Now of course that particular functionality has been nerfed a little bit, and rightly so. It's definitely a little bit broken, but I digress. And so his rating today has fallen off to a 3, useful but still niche, kind of more isolated to Demon Lord clan boss affinity friendliness, or just like a shield set champion as a tank in arena. Rule the Huntmaster is the next fusion, and unfortunately for him, he's been pretty bottom of the barrel ever since he came out. He is one of the first champions introduced into the game with the Hex mechanic in the kit tier on the A3, but this predates the existence of Hydra clan boss, and so his utility back then was basically non-existent. He does have one of the highest base attacks in the game for an attack-based nuker, and his multipliers are pretty substantial, so he does hit quite hard, but he's always been very hard to set up, and that has not really changed over time, and so he has not really improved in terms of utility over the years. Herndig is next, and I have to admit a little bit of bias because he still to this day is one of my favorite fusion champions in the game, so I gave him 4s across the board. He was a traditional style fusion, and he has a lot of fun, quirky utility and can cycle through his abilities extremely well with the extra turn on the A1 that also resets the cooldown of the A3, and the A2 and A3 are fairly strong AoE attacks that bring you weaken, potential for HP burn, as well as decreased defense and decreased accuracy. So a very, very solid champion who's most seen nowadays, or most used nowadays against the Dark Fae, but even when he came out, he was just a good overall utility DPS, and now he's kind of faded a little bit, but he's still S tier for Dark Fae, which is probably one of the most important, if not the most important Doom Tower boss for you to be able to farm. Versolf the Grim was a fragment summon champion who also came out back in the time when traditional clan boss teams were a lot more useful, so he earned a 3 on release because he did have a nice ability here on a 3-turn cooldown, increased defense and ally protection, which is a staple of traditional clan boss teams, and he also brought the leech, which could help your team heal up in between the clan boss's attacks. At the time, this also was one of the strongest HP-based damage dealer attacking abilities, but it was predicated on having some form of CC out there, which was again hard to set up, kind of like Rule of the Huntmaster. Since then, he has decayed down to a 2. I think he's just a lot less helpful now, even though he still has the niche use case in Demon Lord clan boss teams, but there are a lot of options in terms of just having a double ally protection team, and you don't necessarily need a legendary with books in them to perform that role nowadays. Mother Cybele was a very interesting fusion when she came out. Basically, no one really knew what to do with her in terms of her A3, the HP swap ability, block damage, and some other utility, and then the Revive on Death was just not really a thing that you needed to do, and the AoE on the A1 was kind of nice, but she was basically just like a troll in arena with a stun set on the A1, so practically she was pretty useless, and again, this predates Hydra, where she did see a little bit of a resurgence of usage. You can put her in a curse set or a provoke set and stuff like that, and still have the AoE decrease speed and just have her spam the A1 continuously. So she had a little bit of a resurgence, so I upgraded her to a 3 in today's rating system relative to her utility in Hydra. But outside of that, she doesn't really see much use. Rorik Wormbane was a fragment summon champion, and he's one of my most hated fusion champions of all time. He just doesn't really do anything that useful despite having some potential. I think the easiest fix would be to allow him to fully deplete the turn meter here and then place a stun on everyone. That would be pretty solid for a buff, and then he'd have a little bit more utility. But as it stands right now, he can only decrease the turn meter by 75%, meaning that in many situations they're likely to not have their turn meter fully depleted, which means you don't get the stun, which means the ability practically didn't do all that much. So he's a 1 when he came out, and today, without any buffs or changes over the years, he's still a 1 in my opinion, practically useless. With Sigmund, the High Shield, we're back to kind of middle of the road champions who have a little bit of utility. I think his biggest problem was that he was a hybrid style fusion, which made him a lot more difficult to get, but he did nonetheless have a big shield with some strengthen as well as an AoE provoke with decreased attack. So he was a really solid progression style champion, but people also had to weigh the fact that they could get Demitha from his fusion, and she enabled a significant amount of unkillable teams. And so she as an epic for the fusion was a lot more appealing than the legendary itself. So a lot of people traded their Sigmunds out just to get a copy of Demitha. Over time, he's still kind of maintained his middle status just because he is somewhat useful for progressing in Hydra Clan Boss with the provoke for the head of decay as well as a decreased attack and then defensive buffs to help your team stay alive. Vlad the Nightborn is the first example of a champion who experienced a glow up thanks to a buff. He was an extremely underwhelming champion when he came out, especially being a Void legendary despite being a fragment summon, which is a lot more accessible. He just had basically an AoE leech, and then this ability, which is now an AoE attack, decreased defense and block active skills, was a single target ability, which was pretty darn useless. But nowadays, I do give him a 4 for very impactful because he is extremely useful in PvE content. Block active skills is a very solid way to control enemy waves, on top of enabling them to take more damage from decreased defense. Turn meter control as well as leech allows your champions to heal up. And funny enough, he is still the only champion with an AoE decreased attack in the entire Undead Hordes faction. Tatua Ramhide was, I believe, the Christmas fusion back in 2021, and he is another example of a champion who's kind of ridden the middle of the road for his entire lifespan. He was a traditional style fusion, most famous for his Brogni-like abilities with the block debuffs and increased defense. So he was a good substitute champion for traditional Demon Lord clan boss teams. And then he had a pretty sizable shield on the A3, granted on Fortune cooldown, but also the Perfect Veil, which did see a little bit of benefit or resurgence of benefit against Hydra clan boss. Notably, he also had some use cases against Bommel because he has an A1 with decreased accuracy that is on a 1-turn cooldown because it's an A1, but it lasts for 2 turns, 100% land rate. Next up, we have a stretch of fusions that I wasn't actually around for. I did happen to take a hiatus from the game around this time frame for I think 3 or 4 months or so I didn't have the opportunity to complete any of the next few fusions we're going to talk about. And what that means is I don't necessarily have a good read on how the community sentiment was back at the time because I wasn't really paying attention, but I did talk to some folks to make sure I had the right idea based on how they perceived today. Opening Clanfather, when he came out, is the epitome of the 2 rating, where he was touted as one of the best healers in the game, but there was nowhere in the game where you needed him to heal for your team. He was a fragment style fusion, and nowadays, after his fairly recent buff, he has seen a resurgence in utility against the Chimera clan boss specifically, but I don't think that puts him above a 3 in the ratings because he only has that one area where he is a little bit more impactful. Karato Fox Hunter I also wasn't around to see, and of course he is the companion champion for the infamous Yumiko. He was a traditional style fusion, and I do think he's another example of a middle of the road champion. AoE block active skills is useful mostly for PvE, less so for PvP, but nonetheless it can be useful against mythicals in the current era. And then he has a 2-turn duration stun, which is fairly unique, but his kit is a little bit hampered without Yumiko in the team, and she is of course a lot harder to acquire, so you typically won't get to see that part of his kit. But if you do have them together, he is a lot stronger. Nari the Lucky is the last of the champions that I wasn't around for, and he's honestly just been like Pixnil kind of dragged through the mud over the years. It's just a very underwhelming fusion. He has an AoE provoke and a counterattack. He can steal some buffs from enemies when he starts his turn, and he has a fairly weak combination of debuffs, that being decreased accuracy and decreased resistance. He just doesn't really have a place in the game. Yes, he can be somewhat useful in Hydra Clan boss, but you're probably better off just running a Visik so you get for free if you want a 3-turn cooldown AoE provoke. Thankfully, I came back to the game just in time for Gaius the Gleeful, one of my favorite bomb champions in the entire game. And when he came out, he brought about the resurgence of bombs in arena meta. He was a pioneer of the kamikaze strategy, where whenever he dies, he blows up all bombs on all enemies, so you can pair him with some Soul Drinkers or some other bomb champions and sacrifice him to end up winning the fight, even if your entire team had died. Dice was a Fragment Summon champion, and I do think he was very impactful when he came out, so I'm giving him a 4, but he has since fallen off to at most a 3 just because of the popularity of the Polymorph Blessing, which negates a lot of the bombers in the current meta. Fivefold of the Thorn was another one of those weird champions when he came out. He was a Fragment Summon champion who, kind of like Conjure the Cyclone, had the ability to play some of his debuffs even if it's a weak hit. He was a pretty solid provoker and healer across multiple abilities, 2 chances to provoke between the A2 and the A1, as well as an AoE leech and a strengthen, and then a shield with some healing. But his release predated the change to Hydra that allowed you to provoke the Head of Decay, and so at the time he was pretty useless when he came out, so I gave him a 2, but over time, because of that change to Hydra, he became a 3. With the advent of Helikath, we're back to another game changer at the time of his release. He was a pioneer of Demon Lord clan boss teams, but in this case more on the unkillable front, with of course his AoE block damage on a 4-turn cooldown, and that set off a new wave of access to unkillable teams that people who had yet to pull a Sir Nick and or a Roshkar the Tower, and allowing them to upgrade into an unkillable clan boss team for the first time. Since then he has fallen off slightly, but I do think he's still a solid option for making an unkillable clan boss team. That will never change, and he has seen some utility in like live arena or just any arena, just because block damage can be meta, protection sets are a thing, and he counterattacks, and so he can be very annoying and deal sneaky amount of damage while ignoring shields and block damage. Walking Tomb Drang was an interesting champion as well when he came out, a Fragment Summon champion who was somewhat useful, but he kind of grew in utility over time. He's most famous of course for the irresistible AoE HP burn and being able to activate it on the A1. When he came out, that wasn't the most useful thing. Hard mode spider wasn't yet a thing, and so any old HP burner could do, but now with hard mode, it's a lot more reliable to have an irresistible AoE HP burn. Of course, he's strong against the Frost Spider as well, and of course he had his time to shine when it came to soloing hard mode Ice Golem. So with all of that utility in mind that is still relevant in the endgame here, I think he has earned the 4 status over time for very impactful. Lonatharl was a poorly received champion at the time. He was another hybrid style fusion, which made him a lot more difficult to get, and he was basically touted as a Scarab King specialist with destroying max HP on the A1, the AoE shield on a 3-turn cooldown for a 3-turn duration, and the ally attack on the A3, which helped turn meter control teams with Allure and other such champions. Because most people at the time just used Euros the Soul Cage to kind of solo and finish off Scarab King, he really didn't see that much utility, but over time he upgraded himself to what I consider to be a 3, just because ally attack champions have become a lot more useful in the game, especially champions who bring in all allies to attack a single enemy. Mighty Uko was a Fragment style fusion. He was everywhere when he came out back in the day because of the super annoying A1 decrease attack, but super popular in a stun set because of the A2 that would strip off buffs, thus allowing him to place the stuns. And technically it was a bug, but he could stun on both of the hits just because each of the hits did a separate thing. So he was extremely annoying in arena, in a stun set, or a provoke set. That aspect has since been fixed, so he only has the chance to stun on the first attack. And of course, with the addition of Stone Skin entering the meta, it's a lot harder to strip buffs, as well as the polymorph being a thing, which can easily get him polymorph by trying to strip buffs and place debuffs on top while also trying to CC with the set. So he's fallen down a little bit, but he still has some utility in a lot of Hydra Clan boss teams, myself included. Marinix is another champion who is definitely bottom of the barrel and has not changed that much since her release. She was a traditional style fusion way back in the day, and she was another take on Hex champions in the game with the Hex and the AoE decrease defense, which does sound useful on paper, but has just never been useful in any particular area in the game. She does hit fairly hard, but you need a lot more than that when it comes to bringing utility for people's teams, and so she hasn't really seen much use at all. Morrigan wasn't a very popular champion when she came out. She was kind of considered to be the poor man's Lysandra, and of course Lysandra on paper was better in terms of turn meter manipulation because she could also fully deplete on her A2, and she most certainly sat around in people's vaults for many years, but with the introduction of the Cursed City, specifically Amius, her passive is absolutely god tier when it comes to fighting that boss whenever she's allowed within the restrictions. To have a protected hero reduction just by taking a turn is extremely powerful, so she has maintained a niche in the game, moving from more of an arena center champion to an Amius center champion, but not really changing her score of a 3 overall. The Christmas fusion for 2022, Nishak Verminlord traditional style, and was the second bomber fusion that they added into the game, but also saw a lot of play as an AoE poisoner just because of how his passive worked with the bombs turning into poisons. Nishak was a borderline game changer when he came out, just because he was useful in so many different areas. He could be in PvE as a bomb turning into a poison champion. He could be a bomb champion for the arena, and he still has that purpose nowadays. Bombs again kind of fell off a little bit with the introduction of polymorph, but with the soft counter of pinpoint and feral gear coming into the game, he has seen a bit of a resurgence again in the arena or in PvP settings. And of course, he is most well known for pioneering the one-shot strategy against Bommel the Dreadhorn in the Doom Tower. Probably still one of the hardest bosses for people to get through when it comes to the Doom Tower. Shout out to YST for discovering that strategy and sharing it with us all. Pythion was up next, and he was a Fragment Summon champion, and he has aged super well, and he was still super powerful when he came out. He was touted as someone on par, but a little bit worse than a Duchess. AoE Team Revive, full cleanse with some healing, and then some healing on the E1. The cleanse does have block debuffs. Super tanky champion, super resilient champion, a damage reduction on the passive, and just an overall super solid support for keeping your team alive and running. Definitely impactful when he came out, and he's still useful in PvE and PvP alike in today's meta. Oella was one of the initial sets of the Sylvan Watchers faction, and when she came out, she was fairly unpopular. People didn't really know what her kit was useful for, especially because increased resistance is a fairly weird buff to have, because it's only impactful if you actually get a turn to use it. Otherwise, you're at the mercy of whatever the enemy plans to do to you, and so you have to go first in order to get an impact of this ability. But she's probably most well known for her passive to place a significant amount of continuous heals on your team whenever they take damage, and so she's kind of a great healer alongside the healing on her A2. She did see a little bit of a resurgence when it came to being one of the primary duo companions for hard mode Ice Golem alongside an Artak or a Walking Tomb Dragon. Supreme Elhain was a Fragment Summon champion, and once again the return to the middle of the road style of nukers. She has fairly decent multipliers, and she's very strong as like an anti-Necroth the Great champion with the A3 ignoring ally protection, strengthen, and shield, and she can cycle through her abilities fairly well because this will give her an extra turn if she kills an enemy, and then this AoE will reset the cooldown of the single target ability if she kills someone, so she can cycle through and kind of take out your team once she gets a bit rolling. But despite all of that, she's not truly endgame meta for the arena. Razelvarg is a very unique champion. He was a traditional style fusion, and he's one of the only champions in the game who can actively increase his speed throughout the duration of a battle, but also brings AoE leech, which can be useful, as well as the increased speed to power up said passive. I think when he came out, he was useful in his own right. He was part of a lot of clan boss teams, Unkillable and the like. Fairly decent champion for Hydra as well, and he has seen some play against hard mode Fire Knight, so I think upgrading him to a 4 for very impactful is accurate considering how many areas of the game he's useful in. Unfortunately, after Razelvarg, we hit a bit of a slump in terms of fusion quality with Jetney the Giant, who's basically a slightly more powerful War Maiden on her own, which is just not that useful anywhere in the game, because anywhere you'd probably want to use her, War Maiden would suffice for getting you the AoE decreased defense, and she's a rare who can do it a lot better. And even then, you also have Armina, who's an epic, who also has 3-turn cooldown AoE decreased defense. So practically useless, has stayed the same, but I do think she has seen a little bit of play in the Cursed City. Jetney was followed up by another underwhelming Fragment Summon champion, that being Great Hoof Loriaka, who I touted as the worst fusion of 2023. And she was again one of those champions who had some utility, but nowhere to really use it or apply it in the game. She has since seen a buff that has given her one more buff on this ability. I think the increased accuracy was added, but she formerly did the block debuffs and turn meter fill. And then on her A2, they added, I believe, decreased accuracy on top of the decreased resistance. But to me, she hasn't really improved that much in terms of where you want to use her in the game. But nonetheless, I did upgrade her to a 2. So she probably has some niche use case in the game, but it's not really going to help majority of people. After those two fusions, we bounced back hard with the Newt fusion, a traditional style absolute game changer who's still super relevant even today. Of course, most famous for the triple hitter enemy max HP single target ability here, Blessed Bash. He absolutely changed the game, being able to one-shot some of the old bosses in the game and still being a staple of killing bosses quickly in terms of the modern era. He definitely has some competition out there with the likes of Acrizia, Marius, Wallmaster, Atharion, but nonetheless, Newt is still a staple of single target boss encounters. Not to mention arguably the most important hard mode Fire Knight champion in the entire game. Emek Trunkart was another one of those weird champions who wasn't that positively received at the time of his release, and also suffered from the fact that he was a hybrid style fusion, meaning he was a little bit harder to get than normal. He's of course well known for the AoE taunt and Unkillable with the shield, as well as the synergy with other shield abilities, cooldown reduction, and being able to grow a shield on the A1. Of course, there was the whole controversy with the Corpulent Cadaver Caver, infinite shield growth thing going on. And so we've seen some nerfs over the years when it comes to shield growth, shield usage, as well as taunt when it comes to Hydra specific utility. And so I think with all those ups and downs combined, he's basically stayed level at a 3. He's having some use cases, but still being fairly niche. Strategist Islin was a fairly underwhelming champion when he came out, in my opinion, but I do think a lot more people saw value in him than I did, so I'm willing to compromise and give him a 3 across the board. I do think he helped a lot of people progress when it came to Hydra Clan Boss. He's a good mischief tank. He has Provoke on the A1 for the Head of Decay, and then the AoE decrease speed, as well as the ally protection to protect your team. So I think he could do a lot of work to keep your team running, keep them alive, but I have definitely never used him ever on my account. And in fact, the only reason I even summoned him as a fragment summon was because I pulled a duplicate and I wanted the Faction Guardian for High Elves. Bambus 4-Leaf was a traditional style fusion who was definitely very confusing when he came out. He always puts himself to sleep. He was the introduction of the Enfeeble debuff. And on paper, he sounded like a pretty cool champion, but people had honestly no idea where this champion could even be used. And so I definitely think he started off as a 2 and unfortunately hasn't really changed from there. I do think you saw a little bit of usage against Dragon Hard mode if you run him specifically in an Avenging set. Shout out to Nubkex for pioneering that strategy. But other than that, he really hasn't done all that much for a lot of people. Granted, he does have some usage in some Hydra teams, but again, just not really as useful as he could have been. I think his biggest drawback was that on his passive, he was not able to transfer CC debuffs from allies onto himself to effectively cleanse them whenever he could. Timid the Fool was definitely not a well-received champion when he came out, just because of the counter synergy between his abilities. He has an AoE buff strip, but it increased accuracies on the other ability with the CC, but you wouldn't be able to land the CC if they still have their buffs up, and so it just doesn't really work as clean as it might. But nonetheless, he does have a polymorph proof buff strip on the A2, which is definitely impactful in certain areas of the game. And so I think it's fair to say that he stayed a 3 the entire time because of the utility that the A2 brings. Ugyr the Worm Eater was another fragment style champion just like Timid the Fool, who kind of did something similar, but he was not polymorph proof. He was supposed to be like the super anti-reviver champion because of the A2. It can remove all buffs, and this would activate whenever champions got revived on a 2-turn cooldown. But like I said, with polymorph in the game, he never saw the light of day, and so he's basically stayed a 2 with the unhelpful niche of an AoE buff strip his entire existence. Christmas 2023 brought us Blizzard the Howler, who was supposed to be kind of like a Fire Knight hard champion in place of a Newt, but of course he doesn't bring enemy any max HP. He's still useful a little bit in like the Cursed City variations. He does have an AoE freeze, and then freeze on the A1 triple hitter, which is just good for breaking the shield and freezing, but he honestly hasn't really seen much play outside of that. But I do think he provides enough utility to consider him to be a 3 in the useful but niche category. Zinogre Blademaster, part of the Monster Hunter collaboration, was again kind of another champion who was meant to be for Fire Knight in both forms, normal and hard mode. Notably, she doesn't bring any freeze, which I think is a drawback for her kit, but she does bring a lot of attacks across all of her abilities. A triple hitter on the A1, a quad hitter on the A2, and then another quad hitter on the A3. I think a decent amount of people were able to get some utility out of her for hard one Fire Knight, which is still one of the hardest dungeons in the game to complete reliably and quickly, and so I think it's fair to say that she's been middle of the road ever since, with a 3 for useful but niche. White Queen Encore was a fragment summon champion, and I do think she was heavily underrated for her prowess on her own. She was definitely overshadowed by the introduction of White King Narcisse, who of course was the counter to Taurus and Marichka. On the A1, she does have the ability to reduce the cooldowns of ally skills, which can help counter a little bit of the lockout meta that will never ever go away, and then she also has the Godseeker Neri style revive on the A3. Plus, she has the added utility of being able to effectively steal or take on CC debuffs from whoever has the highest crit damage on your team, which you can choose by tuning your team appropriately. And so you can protect one of your nukers from any type of CC. Plus, she also has the chance to resist it if you build her with high enough resistance, or you run her in Stone Skin where you can't take any debuffs anyways. I think more and more people are starting to catch on to what she can bring to an arena team, and so I think she's held steady at her 4 status of very impactful. Next up, we have Armand's the Magnificent, game changer or game breaker, depending on how you want to look at it. But of course, he has cemented his status in arena for his notoriously annoying ability to keep you locked down forever with the A2, as well as to sheep targets at will with the A3, on top of the broken, absolutely busted passive that can lock you out whenever you pop out of the sheep and gives him a ton of turn meter for doing everything he does. No surprises there, 5s across the board despite being a hybrid style fusion. He changed the game when it comes to arena, but also kind of made a lot of wave content very trivial just because of the sheer amount of control he can bring to a team. Illustrated Dream Song was a Fragment Summon champion, and unfortunately she suffered a little bit from the aftermath of Armand's because he was so broken that everyone wanted him, and a lot of people did not have the resources to go for her, and so they kind of underrated her capabilities when she came around. But I do think she's kind of grown more into where people understand exactly how useful she was in terms of utility against Hydra Clan boss specifically. Increased attack and increased speed with some turn meter fill, and then decreased speed with weaken and some turn meter push back. So super strong in the arena as well as with her aura in arena battles, and then super strong against Hydra Clan boss more specifically just because of bringing a lot of buffs and useful debuffs to the table. I think she has maintained her relevance over many months, and so I still give her a 4 across the board for very impactful. Next up, we have another game changer, but in a slightly different way with the Vault Keeper Wixwell. Of course, the community chosen fusion champion, and most well known for his, of course, increased defense and the massive shield, plus the intercept stacks, the introduction of intercept as a buff that you could use in the game, and then of course his ability to extend the duration of abilities and increase the value of the shield, entering a new era of infinity shield compositions. Despite the nerfs to infinitely scaling shield, he has still maintained a significant amount of utility when it comes to Demon Lord Clan boss. He can still have a lot of infinity teams run if you have a powerful enough champions alongside him, and he's still useful and relevant in places like Hydra Clan boss. Unfortunately, after him we had the stinker known as the Incarnate, the Arbiter Companion champion, who is a hybrid style fusion, meaning she was very difficult to do, on top of being absolutely practically useless because he's just not that helpful to a team. You're trading out a slot that you could use anything else for some champion who kind of helps Arbiter a little bit, and it's just not worth that slot. So she has never changed, never been buffed, and she is still as useless as when she came out. Packmaster Shaik was an intriguing Fragment Summon champion when he came out, kind of touting the release of future hounds that could synergize with his ability. He does have AoE block buffs, as well as the ability to taunt, which at the time was a little bit more relevant for usage in Hydra Clan boss to help out a lot of people. Also, he can apply Hex on his passive, but since the changes to taunt relative to Hydra Clan boss, he has since kind of fallen off, and we have still yet to see any future hounds that have come into the game to synergize a little bit better than the ones on the docket for his abilities. I do think it's fair to keep him at a 3 despite the changes in the game, but I can also see the argument for dropping him down to a 2 after the changes to Hydra Clan boss. Score the Half Spawn was another traditional style fusion that brought another champion in the game that had the prowess of AoE Hex, which has some usefulness against Hydra Clan boss, and he was a pretty decent damage dealer in that regard, but he hasn't really seen much use case outside of that. I think it's fair to say that he's kind of once again middle of the road with a 3, but I could definitely be argued down to a 2 with the recent changes to Hydra Clan boss. Next up, we have Thor Feyhammer, the most recent hybrid style fusion in the game. I'm definitely not as hyped as other people are on him in the game, but nonetheless, I have seen what he can do, and so I think a 4 appropriately categorizes his usefulness and impactfulness. He's a very strong AoE dealer, specifically against PvE, but he's also decent in some PvE use cases, just because of the sheer amount of damage that this champion can put out, and his ability to scale it up and increase it a little bit over time. After him, we had the stinker of Brewguard, Jeroboam, who honestly, I still to this day have no clue what he was supposed to do, or what he is supposed to do. He has a little bit of cleansing in his kit, and his passive would suggest that he's meant to counter a little bit of Armand's, but he doesn't really do it all that well, so he's just really never seen the light of day, so has earned the status of practically useless. Brennel Hagbane was the Halloween fusion from this year, and generally speaking, on her own without Hansel, she's not really that useful, so she's definitely maintained the 2 status, and I don't really see that changing anywhere in the near term. She was a traditional style fusion. But thankfully, to cap off the end of 2024, we had the addition of some fairly impactful champions, first of which being Stalk the Broken, a very solid poison champion, but also an AoE HP burn and poison activator, so he is a staple of a lot of people's dragon teams, spider teams, as well as any usage in PvE. And his passive has use cases in PvE and PvP alike, where you can ignore block damage on unkillable, which can be useful in some situations against like Marichkas or like man-eaters and bushies, anything you can think of that has block damage or unkillable. And then of course we do have the most recent fusion in the game, Lady Noelle, and I do think she's in a fairly interesting spot, being underwhelming in some aspects, but also being pretty decent in other aspects. I kind of settled on giving her a 4 as well, just because her synergy with Sir Nick is decent. It can enable certain clan boss, Demon Lord clan boss teams. It can also make your team perpetually unkillable, but Sir Nick's lack of utility kind of hampers her a little bit in terms of their synergy together. But even without him, you do have the ability to purge off sheeps, and whenever that happens, or any sheep debuff expires, the champion gets a turn meter filled by 50%. And then she also has arguably one of the best AoE revives in the game that's on a 3-turn cooldown, full AoE, 50% turn meter, 50% HP, but also has the chance to freeze if you want to build her with accuracy, or it can place the freeze that cannot be resisted or blocked if Sir Nick is on the same team. So there is a lot of utility in her kit, and I think the jury is still out for the long-term benefits of her kit, but nonetheless, at least at the time of this recording, I do think she has maintained her status as very impactful in the game. So when we put all of that data together, what do we get? And welcome to those of you who skipped ahead because you got tired of me rambling on about my champion ratings. I have the data in a couple of forms here. They're broken out by each style of fusion, that being traditional, fragment, and hybrid, and of course separate tables for each of the types of ratings, the release rating and the today's day rating. The result is of course the number of each occurrence, and then we also have it broken down by percentage. And for those of you who are more visual, we do have the same numbers plotted in charts, which might be a little bit easier to see and read. So the first thing that is somewhat interesting, as those of you who are more familiar with statistics might guess, is that we have a fairly normal distribution across all of the different styles. And for those of you who are less familiar with statistics, all that means is that majority of the fusion champions are going to be in the middle. They're just going to be average, not super useful, but might be useful in a couple of areas. Very few of them are going to be game changers or absolute stinkers. Starting off with the ratings for champions on release, which again is most applicable when you're deciding to do the fusion. The main takeaway is that the traditional and fragment style of fusions have produced the most 4s and 5s across the board, that being those that are very impactful and those that are game changers. But on the flip side, the fragment summons have produced the most of the worst champions, that being the most champions that are ranked 1 or 2. As I alluded to earlier, the traditional and the hybrid styles have the most normal styles of distributions. You can kind of see that in the numbers here, where it's fairly even on the ends and it peaks in the middle. Same thing for the hybrid style. But notably, the fragment summons are a little bit skewed towards the negative side. And even in fact, we have not yet seen a game changer that was a fragment summon, at least going as far back as Pixneal. It's also worth noting here that hybrid style fusions are the least common type of fusion, and so we would most certainly benefit from more data to support these statistics. However, I do hope that we end up seeing that hybrid style fusions produce the most impactful champions, just because they are typically harder than traditional and fragment summons. When it comes to the ratings for today, which again is a measure of how well these champions have aged over time, it would seem that the traditional style of fusion has the most positive creep, meaning that overall the trend is upward in terms of champion quality or perception thereof over time. Whereas for fragment summons and hybrid fusions, they tend to be collapsing towards the middle from both sides, meaning that a lot of the champions became more relevant but not super relevant, and some of them have fallen off a little bit to less relevant. In conclusion, I think overall traditional fusions do take the win here. They've had most of the best champions that we've seen from fusions, as well as having the best chance of those champions becoming better over time or more relevant over time. Fragment summons come in last because despite the fact that they have produced the most amount of 4s overall, they've yet to produce a game changer in recent years, and they have the highest concentration of the worst fusion champions. And that leaves hybrid style fusions in the middle ground, partially because I don't think there's sufficient data to be comparable to the other two styles, but also the trend just appears better already than fragment summons are at the moment. Now, as fun as this was to explore, I do think that at the end of the day, you should really take every fusion on its own and see about how they can benefit you on your account. Take some time to read through their kit and see if what they bring to the table is going to help you progress, tackle some new content, or be more competitive in the arena. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this mathematical exploration into the quality of the best style of fusion to partake in. Let me know in the comment section down below if there's any champions you think I rated too highly or even too low. As always, if you did find this video helpful, then be sure to hit that like button down below. It really does help out the channel. And feel free to hit that subscribe button down below if you are enjoying the content on this channel for more content just like this one in the future. Thanks for watching and have a good one.